begin now. Good morning to all of you. Thank you for being here for this IDERM Day. Usually we organize IDERM Day in June, but during the pandemic, our programming was somewhat interrupted. Now, there's something a little specific about this edition. We have embedded IDERM Day in our conference on fraternalism, social capital, and civil society. And so the speaker from the main conference, Paul Rich, will join us a little later because he's speaking in a morning session in the Grussier Temple. So that's the novelty for this year. We may do it this way again. It presents both advantages and disadvantages. The advantages are that these sessions can be recorded and can be watched later, which is quite exciting. And then, given the importance of the organization, the conference on the French right, which is so unique to a Masonic identity, well, that has meant that there is more people in the Grussier Temple than in the Lafayette Temple. And that is why I would like to thank you for having chosen to be here. So this is the fifth edition. And the idea was to focus on one theme. We worked on exile, education, colonization last year. And so the idea is to bring together various researchers who present their work on that specific theme or on themes that are of interest to Masonry. And so this time basically is taking forward the theme of last year. Now, last year we organized the conference virtually because, of course, today's theme is closely linked with colonialism. Now, it was a bit of a risk we were taking because we weren't entirely sure that this theme would be of interest to everyone because we're focusing on Lusophone, Anglophone, Francophone slave trade across the Atlantic. And so to say a few words about how we're going to proceed, to begin with, you will hear two talks, one from Fernando de Costa, whom I thank very much, as well as Yvan Pozuelo on the Iberian Peninsula, Portugal and Spain. And they will focus on the 19th century. Then we'll take a break at 10:50, so that's a small change. Unfortunately, we will not be able to watch the final video today, so we'll see when we might be able to screen it. It was a little complicated here anyway, given the size of the temple. And so that means that we'll be focusing on these four sub-themes. At 10:50, we'll take a break to give our interpreters a break as well. And we'll start again at 11:05. I will be speaking then about France in particular. And then at 11:30 to finish, we'll go beyond the issue of slavery and address the issue of Black Masonry, Prince Hall Masonry in the United States with Paul Rich. So that's how we will be doing things. We will have a Q&A session right in the end. We finish at 12:30, so we'll have enough time, I believe, to share our views on these four presentations. But before I give the floor to Fernando, who's going to talk about Portugal. Now, of course, some speakers will speak from behind the desk or will speak standing up like I am, but I may sit down later, I'm not sure yet. But essentially, we'll alternate between the desk and the front. And as we have been doing every 2 years since 2016, well, we are presenting an award for a PhD thesis and a master's. So we're rewarding a particularly interesting piece of research. So this is the fourth edition of this IDERM prize. And as tradition has it, we have been awarding this prize during these sessions. Now, of course, it was not easy to do during COVID, but we will be doing it today. Now, 2022 was an unusual year. Usually, there's 4 or 5 theses that are submitted. This year, we had only 2. And it's important to us to recognize work that is truly focused on the history of Freemasonry. Both of these pieces of work were very good, but they were a bit off topic. And that is why we decided that we would not give an award for the PhD thesis. However, for the master's prize, we had the opposite situation. Instead of 2 or 3 submissions, we had 4 or 5. And so 1 of them was off topic, but 3 were really very, very relevant. And the laureate is here with us, Emily Rondel. So she received the prize for the master's thesis, and her subject, coincidentally, but perhaps not so coincidentally, because we do try to focus on topical issues or issues that are explored in research currently. And so her thesis is on Freemasonry in Martinique from 1770 to 1848. So Emily, please join me to receive your prize. Congratulations on behalf of the jury. Now, many members of the jury are in the other room at the moment, but so 3 or 4 of them are there, but we'll do a bit of a switch. I too will be speaking later in that room. But Emily, would you like to say a few words? Can you hear me? Well, I wanted to thank you for having supported me with the writing of this thesis, and I also wanted to thank members of the jury for this award. Thank you very much. So this master's thesis touches on racial prejudice in the Caribbean in the 18th century, in lodges, and how the French Revolution affected that, and how Freemasonry as an identity changed as a result of that. Now, there were other pieces of research that were very good on the Anti-Masonic Congress, and a third on Freemasonry in Africa. Thank you. Thanks again. Enjoy the conference. I'm going to give the floor now, in the interest of time, to Fernando. We're actually early. I try to keep myself in check. We are indeed a little bit early. So if Fernando is able to give his talk in 25 minutes, we may be able to ask him a couple of questions in addition to the Q&A session at noon. So without much further ado, let me give the floor to Fernando. Thanks again, Fernando, for being here today.
Bonjour. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Eric, for inviting me to be part of this panel. It's a specific panel in a way. Good morning to the interpreters. I've synthesized a text that I already wrote to keep on time. On the 8th of August 1832, the liberals arrived in mainland Portugal and won the civil war in 1834. Is it okay if I speak closer to the mic? They were divided into two factions, the supporters of the 1822 constitutions, more radical, and those of the constitutional charter that gave a fourth power to the king, a moderating power that sought to reconcile the interests of more conservative groups. In September 1833, a revolution brought to power the defenders of the 1822 constitution, then known as Septembrists, opposed to the policy of the supporters of the charter, the Charterists. Both groups will fight each other until 1851. Portuguese Masonry will experience the same vicissitudes as the liberals. In 1834, they were divided into three main groups. The Grand Orient Lusitano, headed by the Charterists, mainly da Costa Cabral, who will become a Grand Master in 1839. The North Masonry, called Orient of Passos Manuel, a Septembrist, who will become Grand Master between 1834 and 1850, and a South Masonry called Saldanha Orient. And this is between those factions, those Masonic factions, that will arise the question of the slave trade. We find mentions of secret societies, secret clubs, lodges, Orient, etc. Those expressions mostly refer to an autonomous lodge or depending on an organization outside of the territory regarding the colonies. The only exception probably being secret clubs. When you read the documents of that period, you realize it describes two realities. On the one side, Masonic lodges, but also secret slave clubs, sociabilities developed for the sole purpose of bringing together Portuguese, Brazilian, and Goan anti-abolitionists. Before the court left for Brazil, there was no significant slave trade in the port of Lisbon. This is an important element that sets Portugal apart compared to the other colonies. For a long time, and until Brazil's independence in 1822, the Portuguese Empire mainly consisted of Brazil. We know that in Lisbon, some merchants funded ships, but there were not many of them. There was a limited number of them as the Masonic activity in Portugal was. That is why the network of merchants and Freemasons developed later than in the rest of Europe. And when doing so, they followed the networks of the trade relations between Brazil, the west coast of Africa, and the ports in the Indian Ocean. The Portuguese relationship networks are different to what will later happen in the other European ports. Harrison studied Liverpool and the relationship between Masonry and the slave trade. He highlighted a significant capital accumulation, and it has no comparison to the mainland Portugal ports. And the same goes for other French ports in Le Havre and Bordeaux, studied by Saunier, for example. Many studies touch on the colonial reality, mainly during the 18th century, and they highlighted traffic and public sociabilities, meaning that it was all out in the open. But Masonry was repressed in the Portuguese Empire at the time, as it will be in the Brazil Empire at the beginning of its existence. That is why the reality of the relations between the slave trade and Masonry only becomes more obvious after the Liberal Revolution of 1820 and Brazil's independence in 1822. The relations between Brazil and the west coast of Africa were the main axis of the traffic. Regarding Mozambique, there were no direct communications with Portugal. Navigation went through Rio de Janeiro, and Mozambique was, in that sense, more of a colony of Brazil than Portugal. Without much of a national debate, the anti-abolitionist pressure came from the colonies first and foremost for economic reasons. It's only at the end of the 1830s that public interventions started to arise with the policy of Sada Bandeira. But his proposals were met with a wave of resistance from the biggest slavers. The UK exerted a pressure to put an end to the slave trade, which is most obviously shown in the exile of the court in Brazil. Rio de Janeiro became the center of the transoceanic trade, and Brazil extended its slave trade beyond the west coast of Africa that were geographically closer towards the Indian Ocean. In a short amount of time, the slave trade became the main economic activity and the only source of income of Mozambique. So, the slave trade will develop in Mozambique and Masonry as well, extending its ramification until the Masonic organization of Lisbon, La Havane, and Montevideo, where the Grand Orient Lusitanian had a lodge called Loyalty way before 1820. The UK put pressure on the slave trade in the west coast of Africa, a heightened pressure, and this coast was subject to more restrictive measures, boosting slavery in the Indian Ocean. That is why Mozambique gathered the biggest anti-abolitionist resistance movement. Over half of the Masons were merchants at the end of the 18th century. One Mason in two was a merchant or a ship captain in Saint-Malo, 2/3 in Rouen, and 4/5 in Nantes. So it doesn't come as a surprise if many French people frequented the Mozambique ports and were Masons. The Ibo Island was used by Arabs and French people alike for slavery purposes. And in that way, the first pernicious doctrines appeared in the Portuguese colony of the Indian Ocean, and the government quickly understood that the risks of contagion came from the French ships and the clubs in the French Isles of the Indian Ocean. The Portuguese government was concerned that Masonry would spread through the French colonies of the Indian Ocean, and Masonry arrived in Mozambique as early as the 18th century, where lodges were formed. In the 18th century, the members of the Inconfidentes from Minas Gerais arrived in Mozambique, who were deported in this territory, including the poet and Mason Thomas Antonio Gonzaga and people such as Eleuterio José Delfim, who studied in Montpellier and originated from Rio, and traveled from Goa to Mozambique as an army officer and then a slaver. Now, the Masonic associations arrived in Brazil precisely through the students' network. Brazilian students were in Coimbra and Montpellier and Perpignan, where there were 2 lodges of Brazilian students, and then returned to their country. The influence of those pernicious doctrines mostly come from Mauritius, where some Mozambicans studied. So the generation of the sons of slavers who left to study in Lisbon, Coimbra, Rio, the Mascarenhas, Goa, and Montevideo is worthy of interest. The influence of the sons of the trade and slave bourgeoisie will be decisive because they came back on the territory after studying in Portugal. The elements we know today reveal the existence of well-positioned and influential Masons in trade and in the Mozambican colonial administration who are acting with cohesion. And it allows us to assume there was a lodge as early as the 18th century. And it seems that there were lodges all throughout the first half of the 19th century without interruption. An Inquisition trial reveals the existence of operational Masonic lodges on this territory before 1812. The complaint of 1812 alludes to the fact that Masonry was relatively well known and people were aware of where they were meeting, who the leaders and main members were. Masons were not only present in the capital at the time on the Mozambique island. Vicente Francisco Rangel is supposed to have received a catechism on the sect of Freemasons from Sofala. So there were Masons disseminated in Sofala, which might have been in operation at the time. The complaint mentions the inscription of new associates in 1812, showing that Masonry was growing at the time. João Batista Moreira, the Baron of Meira, was involved in liberal circles in Porto. He had close ties with great personalities of liberalism. Moreira was initiated into the Armor de Razao Lodge. Moreira remained loyal to his liberal beliefs, and he was the connection between slavers and the regency of Dom Pedro in the Azores. He was in charge of the arrival of slaves in Brazil under one condition, that the slavers would support the regency on Terceira Island. There were 3 main contributors to this, and they provided the main 4 ships that were the first ships of the constitutional fleet. The 1817 Additional Convention, given by the British, leads to significant growth of slavery from 1821 onwards, with the indulgence of liberalism. And Brazil's independence contributes to this growth. The Mozambican economy became a colonial slave economy, and Brazil and Mozambican soon created movements to favor the separation of Portugal, to guarantee and secure the interests and benefits of slavers that felt threatened. They used the Masonic organizations to fight the anti-slavery movement. If the liberals, the slavers and Masons agreed to maintain a traffic for opportunistic reasons, it doesn't mean that a line is to be drawn between liberals and the supporters of the old regime. Vasconcelos Cirne, for example, the governor of Quelimane, was a slaver and remained a staunch absolutionist opponent to Freemasons. So there were both liberals and absolutists among the people defending the right to trafficking. The liberal revolution arrived in Mozambique through a military coup in 1821. Antonio Pinto de Magalhães, the secretary of the government in Mozambique, said in 1842 that there was a secret society since 1835 with connections to lodges in Lisbon, Cuba, and Brazil. The opposition to anti-slavery policies was based on the connections with secret societies in Havana, Rio, and Pernambuco, and also Mozambican and Portuguese lodges. Beyond individual Masons, there were organized lodges in Mozambique since the beginning of the 19th century, including the lodge Union et Fidélité, Union and Fidelity, that practiced the Scottish Rite on Mozambique Island in 1828. In 1843, this lodge was constituted by José Ignacio Andrade Neri, a military and worshipful master, and Joaquim Miranda, a magistrate and a slaver. Joaquim Miranda was a mayor and a member of the government council between 1833 and 1840. He was a known slaver and one of the authors of what was called the leading club of the slaver faction that tried to oppose the abolitionist policy and was involved in the subordination project of Mozambique to Brazil. The Marquis of Sada Bandeira took two abolitionist initiatives in 1836. The first initiative was presented to the Chamber of Peers and was not favorably received. The second initiative dates back to the 10th of December, and he was Prime Minister of a Septembrist government at the time. It was a decree, so this decree was taken in dictatorship, meaning without asking the opinion of the parliament, and it tells a great deal about how confident he was in receiving the support of the parliament for this initiative. It was signed by Sá da Bandeira, Passos Manuel, and Antonio Manuel Lopes Villa de Castro. All three were Masons. The people most opposed to the abolitionist policy of Sá da Bandeira were the Mozambican representatives of the parliament, who were part of Masonry and used Masonry as a means to put pressure to continue trafficking. Masons were on both sides of this fight, abolitionists and slavers. And you can also even find Grand Masters among them, Passos Manuel and Domingos Correa Arruca. De Arruca took advantage of being in Lisbon after the Liberal Revolution to affiliate the Mozambican Lodge to the Grand Orient of Lisbon. He had a long career in the colonial administration. He reached the 33rd degree of the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite and was part of the Supreme Council. He was the third sovereign Grand Commander of the Supreme Council attached to the Costa Orient. Arruca affiliated other Mozambique lodges in the Orient of Silva Carvalho. When he was in Lisbon as the first senator for Mozambique, along with the deputy Teodorico José Abranches, both well-known slavers with powerful political connections. The coincidence between those affiliations within Masonry and office holding in colonies, as well as trade activity, is important to truly understand the involvement of Masonic factions in colonial slavery. The Marquis of Fronteira e Alorna, a chartist, was quite ironical about the policy of Sá da Bandeira in his memoirs, claiming that the latter was a staunch enemy of slavery, who was unwittingly surrounded by slavers, his close friends, who entrusted with important positions in the colonies to put an end to the traffic they were about to carry out themselves. This way of working can be seen in the consequences of the appointment of some governments. João Carlos Augusto Gravenburg, the Marquis of Aracati, was a Mason and a governor in Brazil of the states of Pará, Ceará, Mato Grosso, and Sao Paulo. He was appointed a governor in Mozambique by the Septembrists to uphold the Sabandera law and put an end to the traffic. But once he arrived in Mozambique, he refused to do so, claiming that it was impossible to uphold the law given the overall resistance of the whole commercial circles of the colony. And he did nothing to face the situation. After him, Antonio Ramalho de Sá was appointed governor between March 1838 and March 1840, and nothing changed. He even complained in 1839 of societies organizing to fight abolitionism. This society is a Masonic society, and the Masonic lodges involved in these works do not all follow the same rights, do not belong to the same Orient, or don't even agree on everything, but they are united in resisting anti-slavery. In Lisbon, there is a lodge where Menezes was a venerable worshipful master, and then he was the secretary of the junta in Angola, and the main objective was to gain independence of the African colonies. We are faced with a lodge that sees itself as being a Chartist lodge that consistently works toward the same objective, and some associates gave money under several pretenses to João Gomes da Costa in Lisbon to get some things that are in their interest. Ramalho da Sá was the next governor of Mozambique. Pereira Marino was the next governor, and he was the only one who tried to fight slavery. His official correspondence shows how conflictual his governorate was. And he wrote a book about his mandate as a governor that allows us to better understand the several aspects of the slave trade in the 1840s, including the coincidence between slave clubs and Masonic lodges. Marino affirms that there is in Mozambique a leading club of the slave faction that was installed by Joaquim de Santa Ana Garcia de Miranda. In the end, he was removed from office and decided to publicly denounce the relationships between secret societies and slavery. Antonio Pinto de Magalhães was the government secretary of the province of Mozambique during the governorate of Pereira Marino, and he says, the Africans and the Goans want to reach their goals and continue trafficking. They built to that purpose a secret society that some mestizos join and some degenerate Europeans as well. There are not many members. All of them have very little fortune and no education, but still they have a huge power based on their intimate relations with other secret societies in Havana, Rio, and Pernambuco. Once again, we see that there was an organized network of slavers between the Indian Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean. The political and commercial elites in the colony and in the Portugal government were linked to Masonry, as the reference to slaver clubs shows. And those clubs did not involve merchants or ship owners, but local agents of lower social status. But in both cases, these organizations built transoceanic networks. In each conflict that arose around slavery, those who were fighting for abolitionist measures and restricting the ship owners' actions, denounced the secret societies and their articulation between Portugal, Brazil, Montevideo, Havana, and Mozambique. In the 1840s, the Chartists consolidated their power, and at the same period, during the same period, many rich slave traders came back to Portugal. One of the most well-known is Joaquim Ferreira dos Santos, Count of Ferreira, who was a financial backer of Costa Cabral. The connection between the latter and slavers are well known. After the coup in January 1842, the Count of Ferreira became an active financial backer of the Chartist policy that rewarded him by elevating him to peer of the kingdom. With the emergence of the regeneration in 1855, the wealthy merchants continued to arrive, and their huge fortunes allowed the economic development of Portugal. Their accumulated capital was invested in banks, in insurance companies, in railway companies, hospitals, industries, and many other trade companies. Their relations with Masonry are discreet, but do not go unnoticed by the press in the Catholic circles. When the Grand Orient, United Lusitanian Grand Orient was created in 1869, slavery was not a debate anymore. The focus was on forced labor, but that's a story for another day. The circumstances probably led to the fact that in Mozambique, the trafficking was protected by Masonry and slaver clubs with the objective of maintaining slavery. The Portuguese Liberal Revolution not only did not refuse financial help from slavers, but they even regretted not to have not more widely profited from it. Thank you. Thank you for being on time, perfectly on time. You're a Republican, very well. The second communication is in 10 minutes, so we have time for questions, maybe. Thank you, Fernando, for this article, this paper. It shares unique and knowledge that was not well known before. The Lusophone space represents a third of the slaves that were traded over 300 years.
And so it's always a little bit awkward to give a start date to all of this, as it can be a subjective issue. Was it the end of the 15th or the early 16th? But I believe that it's 4 million slaves that were traded by Lusophone countries. In France, we're quite used to saying that the slave trade was in the 18th century and it concerns France and Great Britain. But prior to that, there was also Lusophone trade. And so the time has come for questions. If you have any, I'm going to pass the mic around. If you have questions, please feel free to ask them. Or if you have comments, not necessarily questions. Séverine. Good morning. Thanks very much. Now, at one point, you talked about students from France who went to the Bourbon Island. Do you have any more data about this to explain how these students in Mauritius, what their role was really in all of this? The interpreter cannot hear the speaker.
Non, il y en a deux. Voilà.
C'est bon.
Alors, je recommence.
Let me start again then. As I was saying, I do have a longer text with all of this information, but there is a study by a Brazilian researcher called Barata, and he studied Brazilian Masonry in the 18th and early 19th centuries. He studied two Brazilian lodges in Perpignan at the beginning of the 19th century, and so I based my work on that research. And so the network of students is a part of a case study where I explain the story of a Mason who went to India, and while heading east, he ended up going to Brazil first, and he met these students who were initiated. They became Freemasons. They went to Mozambique then and became pillars of Masonic relations. And so there is this network of students in the colonies, so people who were initiated in France, in the Netherlands, in Great Britain, and there are other students in other parts of Europe too. I think it's interesting to look at these students who go back to the colonies and then build these Masonic networks and their role in the slave trade. Thank you very much. Is there another question? We have a bit more time, perhaps one or two. I have a question, actually. I found your presentation extremely interesting, particularly on Mozambique. Mozambique comes back frequently, but Angola not so much. Although Angola was really where the slaves came from. So modern Angola today, for the French slave trade, was where the slaves came from, because historically that is where the Portuguese actually set up a stock, if you will, of slaves. So why have you focused on Mozambique more than Angola? Well, there are two reasons. First of all, we don't know that Freemasons were present in Angola. There's only one mention of it in an official report. The other reason is as follows. British repression against the slave trade in the Atlantic Ocean was very much present in the 20s and 30s on the Atlantic coast, and so the anti-abolitionist resistance came from Mozambique, where the slave trade was growing exponentially as compared with what was happening with the Atlantic trade, given the British position. And that it's interesting because for Brazil, Angolan slaves were closer and cheaper, and so having to go to Mozambique to bring back slaves to Brazil, to Cuba, or to Saint-Domingue was more expensive. And so it's in the Indian Ocean that the anti-abolitionist slavers for the Portuguese case were extremely strong. Thank you very much. I'm going to give the floor to Jean-Luc for another question, then we'll continue. Good morning, and thank you very much for your presentation. Now, I'd like to make a comment first. When you look at the lists of slaves in Saint-Domingue, very often the word Mozambique or Mozambique comes up as their place of origin. I wanted to ask about slave trade in the 19th century. So we talked about Mozambique, Mozambique to the Americas. But was there also a trade going towards the Arab world? So Zanzibar at the same time was also involved in the slave trade. We talked about the Western slave trade, but what of the Arab slave trade, which was actually 1.5 times the volume of the Western slave trade? So, the slave trade from Zanzibar, and what of the slave trade from Mozambique to the Arab world? Well, probably, but the timeline is somewhat different. So the slave trade, be it the Arabs or Indians, Goans, even the French from Mauritius also were involved in the slave trade to other countries. But it's after Brazilian independence and the liberal revolution in Portugal that the slave trade changed to focus more on Brazil and Havana and Saint-Domingue. And so you're right on the 18th century, the beginning of the 19th century, but later the trade went from Mozambique to the Americas. All right, we're going to keep going. We're going to give the floor to Yvan. I'm sure he'll do great. Yes, indeed, he's going to talk about the Spanish-speaking world.
Bon, je vais commencer.
I'm going to begin. Good morning to all of you. I'm delighted to be back here again to be able to discuss Spanish Freemasonry. Now, it's been many years that British, French, Portuguese, Spanish historians have come together in various conferences to talk about our history. And while we are indeed Spanish, French, British, Portuguese, our countries have a colonial history, And so very often that comes back to the forefront when we looked at contemporary history. And that's the case in Spain. It's been over 40 years that academia in Spain has started to take an interest in Freemasonry. And so when Eric asked me to look at the relationship between slavery and Freemasonry, I thought that it would be relatively easy because 15 international conferences have been organized with 29 volumes of minutes that are each 800 pages long on average. 300 researchers have published papers and participated in these events. And so I thought that slavery would be relatively easy to do. But I realized that actually there was no research or barely any research that has been done on this issue of slavery and Masonry. The first piece of research, the first article, was produced last year, and so it's extremely recent. And it's about slavery in North Africa. So in Spain, we have all basically all of us researchers have had footnotes on slavery. And so what I've tried to do here is bring all of that information together to give you a broad view of the issue by looking at the official gazettes of Spanish obediences. Now, abolition in Spain was 100 years later than in the rest of Europe, so the timeline is different. And so in these official communications, or we'll come back to them for the second part of our story. Now, Spanish Freemasonry, well, it was pretty much the French that brought it in, be it in the overseas territories or in Spain. In 1804, the French slavers left Saint-Domingue with their slaves and established themselves in Cuba and Puerto Rico. And so slavery in Spain in the 19th century was basically Puerto Rico and Cuba. There were 50,000 slaves entering Cuba until 1773. From 1773 to 1886, there were 1 million slaves. So it's a relatively large number, especially when you consider that this was after the Enlightenment. And so we have Puerto Rico, we have Cuba, and they were the two Spanish overseas territories that were the last to receive independence in 1886. And of course, it's not a coincidence that it was just after the abolition of slavery, whereas all of the other overseas territories had already started getting their independence from 1810. And so the French established the first lodges in Cuba, and the Spanish Creoles were also a part of this story, and there was a kind of fear that started to spread. And so we're going to see how this played out between the liberals overseas and in Spain. So the first milestone is the Constitution of Cadiz in 1812. A proposal was made to abolish slavery. And now, at that time, the proposal was not retained. In Spain, Freemasonry came through the invasion of Napoleon Bonaparte, and military lodges, in fact, helped establish Freemasonry in Spain. And Spanish, who were open to French ideas and the French invasion, became a part of Masonry at that time. But that did not last very long, because when Fernando the Seventh came back to power, he abolished Masonry and then started to promote an anti-Masonry that became very strong in Spain, and this sentiment lasted extremely long. Of course, in the 20s, with the dictatorship, these same tactics of the Inquisition were adopted. So from 1812 to 1886, the end of slavery in Cuba, it wasn't that long ago. So from 1812 to 1886, the debate on abolition led to a struggle between the liberals in Spain. And in Cuba, of course, there were slaves, and in Spain, there weren't any. In Spain, slavery was abolished in 1837, but in Cuba, only in 1886. And there were laws, decrees that led to a certain degree of freedom, lodges in Cuba that started to buy freedom for their slaves. But that led to another kind of trade in the freedom of slaves, particularly women. And so Masonic lodges at that time, on the one hand, wanted abolition, but on the other, refused initiation for black people to Masonry. And as late as 1860, it was still said that black people could not be Masons. And so throughout the 19th century, there was this debate on slavery, and Masonry, particularly in Cuba, continued to be against abolition, whereas in Spain, there was a general sentiment in favor of abolition. With the Glorious Revolution in 1868, the question of abolition seriously began to be considered, and that is when Spanish lodges really began to seek to promote that idea. And so members of Masonic, members of the parliament who were Masons, were, many of them, anti-slavery. But the tendency was the same as for Masonry in general. There were divisions in Masonry as regards the fact that it wasn't possible to talk about politics in lodges, and slavery was considered to be a part of politics. And so in the 19th century, this idea of abolition led to divisions, to clashes, different factions threatening each other with Masonic trials, which was quite common in Spanish Masonry. And there were also divisions between Spanish Masons from Spain and Cuban Masons, where they accused each other of being slavers. In 1880, a law was passed that we call the imperfect law. It's imperfect because it looks like abolition, but it isn't total abolition. And so some Mason MPs voted against that law, and Cuban MPs seized that opportunity to say within obediences that these MPs were actually pro-slavery, whereas actually that the law was imperfect, but it was still passed. And it took 6 more years before full abolition, because there were still 30,000 slaves in Cuba, and in 1886 they again passed a decree that led to actual abolition. Now, what's interesting is that after slavery was abolished, everyone, and particularly Masons, were abolitionists. Once it had been decided, it seemed that people sort of revised their own histories too. And so within Spanish Masonry, the idea that Masonry was pro-abolition was circulated, and that was true, of course, after 1886, but not before. And the story, of course, starts a little earlier. As Eric was saying, it's difficult to point to the actual beginning, and that's what we're here to do, to use Masonic documentation to understand subjects that are of interest to contemporary history. And so we'll see that grandmasters from Spanish obediences at the end of the 19th century were also ended up being prime minister, and that really underlined the fight. Now, slavers knew that abolition was inevitable. They knew that it would necessarily come. And so how could they retain their privilege, their dominance in the long run after abolition? And that was really the crux of it. They said, all right, we can have abolition, but what do we get out of it? Or how can we compensate for what we're losing out? And as my colleague was saying, and in the paper that will be published, there'll be various names and details. But I just wanted to give you a bit of an idea of where the research stands today in Spain on slavery. There's not much research. There are specialists. There in high school, there's a chapter on slavery in history textbooks, but it's true, we speak more about France and the UK, and not so much about Spanish and Portuguese. We know very little about that. And on maintaining privileges as well, in Latin America, a new type of slavery was developed. So after black people, it was Chinese slaves. And in the colonies, particularly in North Africa, there was Arab slavery. Very recently, a doctoral thesis was defended, so on slavery in Morocco, in 3 volumes, very interesting, and it focuses on this, on the abolition of slave trade for Africans, but there are parts of the world where slavery was maintained for certain people in society. And so this was an initial snapshot that I wanted to share with you, and I'd be happy to answer any questions. Thank you, Yvan. I'm so sorry about the PowerPoint. It doesn't seem to have worked, but I don't think that it mattered much. It wouldn't matter for my presentation either. But my PowerPoint served mainly to provide translations, but I don't think that these will be necessary, seeing that the audience seems to be mostly French-speaking. Perhaps there are questions on Yvan's presentation, which is a great follow-up to Fernando. So I'll have a couple of questions too, but perhaps we can start with the audience. Good morning. Charles Lecomte, thank you for this excellent presentation. Now, international organizations that work on slavery estimate that between 30 and 40 million people today are victims of slavery. And so, as you were saying, yes, this is still a reality. Now, I was intrigued by what you said at the end, Chinese slaves. Can you tell us a bit more about that? And I didn't really understand the North African example in the Maghreb by Masons. Can you please explain that? Yes, sorry, I think that may have been a little bit too brief. Now, yes, there are articles on Costa Rica, on Mexico especially, where Chinese migrants were turned into slaves. Now, there has been much research on this yet. But yes, there was a trade. But our colleagues in Latin America were able to study this. There is Chinese masonry, Shinkontong lodges, and these lodges themselves brought over their own fellow citizens to be slaves. And you mentioned North Africa and Freemasonry. Now, at the time, Masonry was pro-abolition, without a doubt, and so Masonic lodges completely condemned slavery in North Africa. Thank you. Yes, thank you very much. Your presentation really underlined the fact that there's a bit of a gap in the research, because it's true that all slaves were not necessarily traded. I'm going to give you two examples. In Madagascar, until 1890, which was the abolition of slavery by Mr. Laroche, who was Masonic and Protestant. So it's a Mason who helped abolish it, but of course it wasn't because he was a Mason, but because he received orders to abolish slavery on the 27th of September 1890. And there's another example of another Mason in West Africa, William Ponty. William Ponty was Governor General of French West Africa during the First World War, but before that he was in French Sudan, that is to say in Mali. And I believe that there are two colonial eras of interest. There is the colonial era during which the slave trade occurred, and then there's the end of the 19th century with the fight for abolition. And William Ponty was a role model in this on this, because he created these so-called villages where slaves could be bought and he would take slaves and put them in these free villages where they could be protected. Now, and of course, many of them converted to Christianity. Thank you. Are there any other questions? Fernando. Thank you, Eric. It's not really a question, it's more of a doubt that I had, because at the end of the 19th century, there were two distinct debates. There was the debate on ending slavery, and then there was the debate on forced labor. And they're different. Now, Spain is different. The debate on slavery came later, and perhaps there was an overlap with the debate on forced labor. So that's a question that I had on the chronology. Yes, I only focus on slavery here and not on forced labor, which is different, which is a category of its own. Well, perhaps I could say a few words as well. It was more of a comment than a question. Now, you really painted a picture where, in terms of research, because as you know, the idea here is to draw links between Masonry and slavery. We see that in terms of research on the links between slavery and Masonry in the Spanish-speaking world compared to the Lusophone world, we see that there is a gap. And on forced labor, of course, one might think that it is a form of slavery, although it may not be so in the legal sense. The Spanish-speaking world uh, still has slaves in the 19th century with Cuba and Santo Domingo. And so conducting research, in particular for Santo Domingo, could be very interesting, although perhaps Masonry was less present than in Saint-Domingue. And of course, I'm wearing two hats here. I also work at the foundation for the memory of slavery, and the question of memory is particularly important to the Spanish, or just as important as anywhere else. I was in Barcelona recently and met with a group that works on memory. But in terms of the Atlantic slave trade, of course, Spain was involved, but Barcelona was not a port involved in the slave trade like Nantes was, for instance. And so the memory of it seemed to be very present. There was also a kind of activism in Barcelona, which is interesting because there was a less physical link than in Nantes or Bordeaux. So just a couple of comments, but perhaps you have something to add. Well, there is an explanation for all of this, unfortunately, and it's 40 years of Franco. Now, Franco, of course, aside from all that he did, also really cut off our history and erased our memory. And there are groups through Spain that are trying to revive this memory after all of these years of democracy. And so perhaps slavery, when you see that there were 1 million slaves in Cuba in the 19th century, well, perhaps that didn't seem like a priority for Spain to highlight. But we're here today. We're here with our colleagues from Portugal, from France, to bridge this gap. Yes, because you do have resources, you do have archives, you do have keen researchers. Yes, and in the case of Cuba is, of course, a number of Francophone historians, Delphine Sapez, Dominique Soucy, Agnès Renaud, they have all done much more research actually than the Spanish themselves, and the Cubans too, because the Cubans have looked at the history of slavery and the history of Masonry, but they haven't really brought them both together. They haven't done the work of seeing who was doing what when. Yes, but that's interesting that French researchers are working on it, but it would be great too for Spanish researchers to do so. Now, the interpreters need a little break, so we're going to take a 15-minute break. We'll start again at 11:10, and I'd like to thank the interpreters as well. That helps us have a further reach, as well as thank the colleagues who are filming. Now, of course, we can still have a chat that won't be interpreted, and at 11:10, I suggest we start again. I'll start, and then Paul Rich is going to tell us about Prince Hall Freemasonry. Thank you.
So we are going to start again. I will tell you about the French lodges faced with the slave trade and the abolition, a new take on it. Between 1770 and 1848, which is quite a classical timeline, because 1770 is considered as the year where slavery is contested, and when Freemasons could have been part of this process and were, for example, with the publication of the Abbé Raynal essay, Histoire des deux Indes. And 1848 is the date of the second abolition of slavery in France. My hypothesis is about showing how the research about the connection between Freemasonry is the door open? Could somebody close the door, please, behind the screen? Is the door closed now? So we're going to start again. Thank you. As I was saying, we will be studying this time period, taking into account the historiography and research in a very concrete way. I am going to start. Next slide, please. This was the introduction, but next slide. So my point is that there was a shift from a mythical vision about a very positive, affirmative role and of Freemasonry regarding slavery, regarding abolition, claiming that they were in favor of abolition only. But it is a bit more complicated. It is not really true to the reality of the relation between Freemasonry and slavery. Here you can see Schulcher, who was a Mason indeed. You can see his statue in the hall of the Grand Orient of France. It is quite symbolical, and it shows the natural and biological connection between Freemasonry and abolition. This is a Freemason. He had a quite interesting Masonic career during the censitory monarchy, and he moved from a Parisian lodge to a Parisian lodge. But highlighting this person shows that Freemasonry is on the right side of history and always has been. In a way, we can see the approach until the 1990s, because then it changed from there. And I often use what was said in the Parisian lodge Philosophe Neustrien, which was one of the first lodges to initiate people of color in 1828. Louis Fabien and Charles Bisset, well-known Masons. It was said in this lodge, all of our eyes, Freemasons' eyes, turn to those two candidates who were victims of a barbaric prejudice and of the most odious inequity. Everything was said in this sentence, and biographers accepted a lot of things. I researched a person who proclaimed abolition in Réunion Island, Joseph Napoléon Sarda Garriga. Some biographies have been written about him. He's a Freemason. He was appointed by Schulcher, who was a Mason, and he was friends with Arago, François Arago. So it gives the impression that all of the 1848 Republicans were Freemasons, and all of the abolitionists were Masons. So the biographer of Sarda Garriga has nothing to do whatsoever with Freemasonry. He states some well-known facts. He is not really thorough regarding his resources. So even him has this idea that all abolitionists were Masons, so Sarda Garriga was an abolitionist. So this idea was disseminated and common ever since the 1848. It was then consolidated and corroborated by the 1980s and 1990s research that created a connection between the 18th and 19th century. It was based on the idea that if Masons were abolitionists after the fall of Napoleon, they were abolitionists before, obviously. Catherine Duprat wrote seminal research on Parisian philanthropy. It is not about Freemasonry and the history of Freemasonry, but still it includes Freemason circles. Next slide, please. This here is Mirabeau. He was not the founder of the Society of the Friends of the Blacks, but still one of the main actors. The founder was Rousseau. He disseminated Masonic values, even though he wasn't Mason himself. A third of the members of this society came from Masonic Persian circles, including a specific lodge. So we came full circle here. Until 1995 and even 2000, this was not even being researched. You could have a little fun and look at who was an abolitionist or not among Masons, but Freemasonry and slavery was not being studied. It was obvious that Masons were on the right side of history. And suddenly it all changed. But when? Next slide. There were previous research by myself and others from the late 90s. This research was based on things that weren't contrary to what I just mentioned, but should have questioned and raised questions among the researchers. First, you had Alain Le Billon, who had an institutional approach. Still a remarkable study. It is quite detailed and exact. He studied lodges in Provence. Alain Le Billon does not tackle slavery or anything like that. That's not the purpose of his study. But still, he could have gotten interested in the fact that Freemasonry was very present in the colonies, including the slaver colonies. It could have raised questions. One might have worn rose-tinted glasses and thought, oh, they must have fought against abolition, etc. But still, at the time, a lot was known about abolition. Pierre Chevalier showed that Freemasonry was an elitist form of sociability, and researchers could have guessed that the lodges were comprised colons. So let's stop feigning being surprised. After losing Canada, the colonial empire shifted to the Caribbean. So first, Freemasonry is very present in the colonies, including the Caribbean, so one might have guessed that the relationship to slavery was a bit more complicated and ambivalent than researchers thought. And then it led me to do further research. I did not want to revise things, review things, but to have a global approach and not excluding the connection between Masons and slavery. Daniel Roche was another important researcher in this regard. He showed that Freemasonry was the favorite sociability method of merchants. And this merchant Freemasonry was also very present in the Atlantic ports. So unless you're a bit naive in a way about Freemasonry, there still was this idea that the Freemasonry was very present in ports with many merchants and naval officers. It maybe could have been guessed that there were connections there. If you take a look at historiography of Freemasonry and the French Revolution, Baruel was not the only one writing in one specific direction. Other people took other direction and approaches. For example, Mollier, who at the time said, it's a bit weird that Freemasonry was the main place where the revolution happened. I'm coming to my second point now. What do recent research show? We have to dissociate the transatlantic slave trades and slavery on the other hand. The recent research showed two things. First, regarding the slave trade, and second, regarding abolition. First, the slave trade became a topic of interest, but not that much. You weren't prohibited from being a Mason when you were a slaver. I've worked on Le Havre, other people on Nantes, and most recently on Bordeaux and La Rochelle, all ports. And each and every time, we realized that there was a strong presence of Masons within the slavers circles. It's quite generalized truth. But that is not what is most interesting about it all, about this research. What is really interesting here is that both cultures are intertwined. As historians, if you do not look too closely, there are merchants in Atlantic ports, many lodges in the colonies, so in a way it's kind of normal, even if condemnable, that some Freemasons were slavers. But it goes beyond that. Both cultures are intertwined. So examples to prove my point. Slave ships carried the same name as lodges, so it's a sign it's a sign of recognition. They acknowledge themselves, both circles. In Nantes, on the certificate for Master Mason grades, it is written that the captain, the Mason, is a slaver. It is written down in black and white. when at the same time it wasn't written down that Masons were Protestants, so there is a really strong intertwining of both circles. Latest example, a lodge in Gorée in 1789 that was short-lived, but still it shows that a triangle can be an arrival point for people. People in Gorée are not foreign strangers to the slave trade, otherwise they wouldn't be in Gorée at all, on Gorée Island. So those are the facts, but now we have to wonder why. What are the reasons? There are two explanations to this phenomenon. One explanation was quite common up to 10 years ago. People said, in the end, this connection is quite normal because it was long-haul trade and this sociability in the ports where you stop on the way to your final destination. So, you have a certificate of Master Mason, you can visit the local lodges, so no big deal. It's quite normal. People will be alone on their own for 4 to 6 months or even 1 year, so they use their certificate as Masons to be received in the lodges. But it is not enough. This explanation is not sufficient, because this explains the first point I was referring to, but not the intertwining of both cultures. The explanation is the connection between part of Freemasonry, because they are not the majority, who frequent, who visit, who know slavers in slave ports, who build a network with them, and who stay quite a long time in the ports. The Grand Orient used those people to deliver patents, for example, so they became deeply familiar with colonial lodges, and so when they return home, they bring back the dominant narrative, which is far from being abolitionist and rather characterized by a prejudice, a racist prejudice. Because of this prejudice, colored people were rejected from the lodges. So there is this sort of cultural shift, this cultural impact. So we have to do the following work. When somebody is Freemason, we have to wonder, are they a Freemason for 6 months or 30 years? Here it is about people who get familiar with a narrative, racist narrative that is not so preeminent in mainland France. Now, let's draw comparisons with the development of racialist theories in Western societies, particularly the research of Silvia Sebastiani and Jean-Frédéric Chaube, whatever your opinion might be. So it is about the rise of racialism from the beginning of the 18th century. And the idea of nobility is very, very strong. This book works on the notion of blood belonging in Spain, and then the connection between nobility and the purity of blood beyond Spain. And we know that Freemasonry is familiar with these ideas in the 18th century. Higher degrees are strongly connected with social aspects, and it's not only Freemasonry's many forms of sociability are deeply characterized by this culture of distinction, of nobility, of setting ourselves apart. So for a whole part of Freemasonry, there are many common denominators with the main ideas of slave traders. Moving on to abolition. Freemasonry and abolition. the problem could be to have a hypercritical approach, saying that Masons are only on the wrong side of history, when in reality there was a really strong connection to abolition. So there was a shift in the 19th century, and it all goes beyond this quite superficial vision and Schulcher and the culture of those great men we rely on to say that Freemasonry were on the right side of history. Taking a look at recent research, on the one hand, regarding the initiation of colored people when slavery still existed, because it was reinstored in part of the French colonies, and it's continued until 1848. It is quite interesting to realize in recent research for Martinique and Guadeloupe that colored people have been initiated into lodges before 1848, so before the abolition during the July monarchy between 1835 and 1836 and 40, that it all happened in Martinique and Guadeloupe, both for the Grand Orient and the Supreme Council lodges. So it tells us something, it's not nothing. And in Paris, it goes back to even earlier years. But it doesn't have the same meaning to initiate a colored person into a Parisian lodge or a colonial lodge. I also want to highlight something else, to insist on something else. There's a connection between Freemasonry and abolitionist circles, in the same way that there was this kind of reverse coincidence before with the slaver circles. But this time, it is all about instilling moral values in the working class for the mainland lodges. It is a true topic of interest for them. We always put the emphasis on libraries and saving accounts for children and educating the masses, but still there is a reflection on the Industrial Revolution and the fate of the working class and the need to instill moral values in the working class, to raise the moral standards so that this opening up of the working class can happen in the best conditions possible. And abolitionist circles had the same ideas regarding former slaves. There are two pillars to abolitionism: the moral and religious aspect that is really strong in the UK, and the economic aspect one should not neglect. Is a free man not more efficient than a slave? So this is nothing new in the 19th century, but it gained momentum. In France, in abolitionist circles, it comes at no surprise, the main aspect is the economic aspect. The economic reason comes first because France is less affected by religion and Christianity than the UK. So, the spiritual and religious aspect was left on the side when Freemasons at the time moved away from this approach. So, both circles meet around a common concern. One circle focuses on the working class workers and the other on former slaves. In 1848, lodges opened up to colored people, and the abolitionists were full of Masons. That is true in France. So this is where we stand right now. So thanks to research, we now better understand the connections, and we have a better vision, a more nuanced vision on both the connection between Freemasons and slavers until the French Revolution, and Freemasonry and abolitionists after that. It is part of our common memory, shared memory, and one side was quite forgotten, which makes sense, because it was regarding in the slave ports, so it only makes sense that Freemasons also neglected this side of the history. That was it for me. Thank you, and I'm ready to answer any question as earlier. Jean-Yves will give you the mic. Jean-Luc, out of mic comments, the interpreter. So this is not a question. The mic doesn't work. You've insisted the interpreter cannot hear. So colored people were initiated into the lodges. They were also elected after that, but there was also the contrary. White people, Freemasons, there's at least one example in Santo Domingo and in Reunion, were excluded from the lodges because they married colored women. So it all brings nuance to the approach. Moving on to Gorilla Island, I would be a bit more cautious about this because I'm familiar with this history. The Gorilla Lodge was created by chance. A Freemason from La Rochelle returning from India, halted in Gorée in July 1789, but the true Masonry really developed in St. Louis in Senegal because the lodge in Gorée was temporary. The counterpart of the Society of the Friends of the Black, it is the Messiah Club, where there were many Freemasons who were not abolitionists. Good morning. I'd like to know when the Grand Orient really positioned itself for the abolition, in favor of the abolition of slavery. What year? There is no clear position, official position. It's rather a general process, but the Grand Orient, I would have guessed that it would have been after the abolition, as it is mostly the time for most societal changes. So there is no official position, which is of interest. It's worthy to mention it. They could have a position before 1848, but we will not be rewriting history here. One last question, and I will give the floor to Paul Rich. It's not a question as much as a comment. Victor Schulcher gave a famous speech in favor of against slavery. He was one of the initiators of the abolition of slavery in Martinique. But at the same time, in Martinique, in the Prêcheurs region, some workers took arms and revolted, and said they also contributed to freeing the slaves in Martinique. Thanks a lot for this contribution. I will give the floor to Paul Rich, that I thank.
And Paul speak about Freemasonry of Prince Hall for sort of rectification of historiography. Paul, you can speak during 25 minutes. Thank you very much, dear Paul.
Dan, you can put that up now.
You must be very
This is a poster you see in many Prince Hall lodges. The composite of it is a segregated black military unit that were heavily Masonic during the 19th century, and they were called the Buffalo Soldiers. They were called the Buffalo Soldiers because at that time the Great West was full of buffalo, and they hunted them to provide provisions for their military. So when you go into a Prince Hall Lodge, you often see these illustrations. In the left-hand corner, there is a famous memorial of black soldiers in the American Civil War. This memorial is immediately across from the capital of Massachusetts in Boston. In understanding this situation, I would like to remind you that the first nearly 100 years of Masonry for black people, they were slaves, most of them, and they were in danger of being enslaved, even if they were free, by people who would kidnap them and sell them into slavery, even though they were not slaves. The lodge that was started in Boston, which still exists, of black people, one incident in its early history was the kidnapping of some of its members who were free. They were not slaves, and they were taken to the West Indies to be used on the plantations, but the lodge intervened, and white Masons in the West Indies intervened, and they were brought back to Boston and freed. American Freemasonry today is the largest segregated racist organization in America, without question. No question but that the Masonic order in America is up to its eyebrows in racism. You know, I speak as a member of the oldest lodge in the country, which is, of course, not segregated. My intention today is to correct some confusions about the status of black Masonry in America. It is a very complicated subject. Could we have two? Now, allegedly, the blue states are Grand Lodges which recognize black Masons. The colored states do not and are segregated. But what does recognition mean? In many of these states which are allegedly integrated with black people, they may not visit the lodge, but the Grand Lodge of their state recognizes their particular Grand Lodge for certain ceremonies. Now, that really begs the question for you of whether recognition can mean simply, I agree you exist, but you cannot visit. And some of these lodges, which are shown by Grand Lodge publicity outfits, are in that category. They recognize the existence of the lodge, but the members may not visit each other. Now, if this was the 1950s, I remember as a boy being very confused when traveling with my parents because I could not figure out which bathroom to go to, because one was for colored men, one was for white men, and I could not figure out as a 10-year-old boy which water fountain to use, because the water fountain would be, there'd be a water fountain for white women, a water fountain for black women, a water fountain for white men, and a water fountain for colored men. And when you were 10 years old, that was rather difficult to fathom. Things have changed. However, in some of the Grand Lodges in America, they give what we call in English lip service to the idea of integration. But for example, a black member will go in, sit down, and all the white people will leave, and the lodge will not open while he is there. Happened just recently to a friend of mine. So American Masons are very duplicitous about this. And I get very annoyed at the assertions. Now, the problem is, among other things, Prince Hall. The lodges, like the United Grand Lodge of England, have been recognizing Grand Lodges which are called Prince Hall organizations of a state basis. They're sometimes called statist Grand Lodges. And they have a commission called the Commission on Bogus Masonry, which then declares illegal all the other black lodges. And that simply is not true, but organizations like the Grand Lodge of England and some other Grand Lodges that should know better have accepted that there is one colored Grand Lodge in each state, and they can in some way recognize it, and that takes care of what they consider to be the problem. Now, the fact is, in some states, there are 6 or 7 black Grand Lodges, some of which have a claim on historical descent from the 18th century from the first lodge, Prince Hall Lodge. Imagine in France if every department had 6 or 7 Grand Lodges, and then it recognized some in other departments, but not some, and had a commission on bogus Grand Lodges to call the Grand Lodges in any other department bogus. So no wonder people find this very complicated. Could we have number 3, please? Now here we have the consecration of a Grand Lodge, Prince Hall for France. These lodges that I'm going to speak about, they are glad to invade jurisdictions. Why shouldn't they be glad to invade jurisdictions? Nobody recognizes them, so of course it's meaningless to them if they annoy you. They're past the point of you annoying them. They just accept that. Now, another factor is white people have always belonged to these. You can see this in photographs of the lodges. They belonged to them because they married a black woman and her family were active in the Black Lodge, so they joined the Black Lodge. So the Black Lodges are not entirely black. Now, this is not because the black people wanted to annoy anybody. They wanted to have Masonry. And so when they were denied access to it by white lodges, they gave up struggling to get admitted, and they created a variety of methods. In the Washington Post, my colleague Colbert King writes recently, white loathing of black people was at the heart of legal and de facto segregation, including the voter suppression schemes being crafted in states. And she recently wrote in the Post in May, white supremacy is doing quite well for itself. Now, there are problems in other countries. So the fact that I am speaking about the United States today does not mean I am not aware of other problems elsewhere. For example, I know a country that has for many years recognized dictators in Africa who were grand masters for life. I'm sure that that's something that could be discussed. So I am not discussing this as a negative person about American Masonry, but I want you to be informed that there is not one Prince Hall Grand Lodge in each state which is authentic, and then a whole bunch of bogus lodges. That is not true. Could we see 4? This is the tombstone in Boston of Prince Hall. Prince Hall is the subject of a number of papers by me about the authenticity of the charter he obtained from the Grand Lodge of England. He certainly did, and this went on for years, and then he created other lodges, and they created Grand Lodges, and these Grand Lodges received their rituals from no else than Albert Pike. And Art Hoyas, who's with us at this conference, has written a long paper about how Pike gave the rituals of Masonry to the black Masons because they wanted to be accurate. He also created a woman's right. Although married, he had a lady friend who was a sculptor and who wanted to have a ladies' order, so he created a ladies' order as well. These embarrassments are not discussed as much as they might be, but the fact that Pike gave his rituals, or Pike helped the women to have their own right, is not what I am getting across today. In the 19th century, the black lodges attempted to have a national Grand Lodge. They called it the National Compact. But about the time of the Civil War, some of the lodges left to form other Grand Lodges. The Grand Lodges that are being recognized by European Grand Lodges are the ones that left the National Compact. The National Compact is supposed to have ceased according to these Grand Lodges, but it did not cease. It still exists in great numbers. So you have 2 designations of Prince Hall in America. You have a lot more. You have a St. John's family, you have a Hiram family, you have other families with historical descent. But you have the Prince Hall Grand Lodges that split from the National Compact and are the ones the white Grand Lodges around the world recognize, if they do recognize them, and that the American Grand Lodges are recognizing. But it is absolutely false that the National Compact disappeared. It's very alive. You can look it up on the web, find out in large numbers. So the problem historians have is that having a Prince Hall affiliation lodge, a PH lodge, and saying, oh good, we've integrated with the Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania, they're a PHA lodge. But in that state, there will be a PHO lodge. And in some states, the PHO, which are the National Compact Lodges, are considerably larger than the Grand Lodges that are being recognized by England and others under the impression that there's only a colored Grand Lodge in a state. Not true. Could we go to 5? This is a list of the Grand Lodges in the state of Virginia. This is not the White Grand Lodge, and this is not the Prince Hall Affiliate Grand Lodge. These are other Grand Lodges which are practicing, have buildings, have journals, have meetings. And these are all Grand Lodges in the Grand Lodge scheme in Virginia. Now, each of these Grand Lodges in Virginia or Oklahoma or California has affiliates with other Grand Lodges in other states. Could we have 6? So they affiliate with Grand Lodges, which may or may not be in their family, the National Compact or whatever. So we have well over 150 of these Grand Lodges, and they have endowments, they have buildings, they even have colleges, but there is no mention of them. No mention. And then people say, well, the Americans are finally getting things organized because they are recognizing the Prince Hall Grand Lodges. Which Prince Hall Grand Lodges are they recognizing? Is a very good question. I want to read from a Hiram Grand Lodge. It says, the Hiram United Sovereign Grand Lodge is a complete jurisdiction. In other words, this is a particular Grand Lodge that has international aspirations and has 5 lodges in Germany, for example. And it recognizes in Georgia a Grand Lodge. And then it comes to speak about what I'm talking to you about today. It says there are other subordinate grand bodies throughout the world under our jurisdiction, these people. Since the late 1700s, and this is the pregnant sentence, this is the key. Since the late 1700s, much of the time spent by Prince Hall Masons has been dedicated to the non-recognition of other subordinate lodges of Masonry in the United States. That's what I'm talking about today. And they go on to say, although some factions may have been denied since this time, the amount of ignorance regarding their origin cannot be refuted. So people who should know better talk about, well, I know about Masonry in America. They have this Prince Hall Black Grand Lodge, and they're beginning to recognize them, although some of the lodges do not. Well, they don't know what they're talking about. Absolutely ridiculous. You saw the list in Virginia. Then they turn around, they recognize these other Grand Lodges. If we could go to the next. Now, what can I say about these subordinate bodies? The incentive for joining American Masonry has been to never go back to the Blue Lodge, but to join the Shrine or the Grotto or the High 12 or on and on, the Order of the Amaranth, the Eastern Star, the Ziots, and so on. So, of course, the black people have all created these organizations as well. So there are white Shriners and black Shriners. And not just one black Shriner, but he might be a black Shriner for one of these other Grand Lodges. So in some states, you will have not one women's group like the Eastern Star, you'll have 8 competing women's groups. And they do take in, as I say, women occasionally. Now, are these bodies Masonic? Well, they are enticements to become a Mason. They have temples, they have recreation facilities, they do all kinds of things. They even, on occasion, have gambling. Do I approve of this? I just am your humble reporter today. I am not endorsing the Shrine or the Eastern Star or anything. Could we do the next one? This happens to be in Baltimore, Maryland. It is a black Grand Lodge. It has beautiful rooms, historic documents going back to the 1820s, and they're very happy, and they extend throughout the state. And there are more of these. This happens to be a Hiram Grand Lodge. There are more members of this lodge than of the Prince Hall Lodge, which is recognized by the Grand Lodge of England. Of course, I saw the Duke of Kent on television the other day, and he does not look like he's much of an executive right now. So he probably is not worrying about this. Could we have the next one, please? Here is the Grand Master of the Hiram Grand Lodge of Maryland. Very nice magazine, thousands of members, orphanage, hospitals, the whole works. Plus, he has women's orders and subordinate men's orders. Recently, he took all the old documents from the 19th century and he had them put in the library of Morgan University because he didn't think that he could sustain a library operation the way it should be, and he wanted people to have access to the preservation of the documents. More people should do that. If you have something like the Grand Orient with a wonderful library, you can have it here. But if you don't have that kind of facility, he's showing great wisdom. His ritual is better than most that you would encounter. His knowledge of the craft is better than most. And he is not recognized by any white Grand Lodge. And of course, he doesn't recognize the Prince Hall origin or Prince Hall affiliate families, either the National Compact or the descendants of the Prince Hall. I'm rather of the opinion that I have succeeded in completely confusing you. The fact is that we have a multiplicity of Grand Lodges, mostly of colored people, but increasingly of some white people, that have nothing to do with regularity. So they would really be happy at the Grand Orient, and they'd agree with you all the way about regularity being, I consider to be utter nonsense. I always say there are 8 or 9 regular Grand Lodges in France. Then there's an irregular, regular one that for a long time was headed by a woman who was not even a Mason. Now, if that is regularity, I need to go back to Harvard and get a vocabulary course. My object today, then, is to send you out into the world. If anybody says Prince Hall, you say, wait, I need a day to talk about it to you. And you can go to Google and get all this. So we are not talking about, Oxford, Cambridge scholarship. I applaud you having your panels. You're back a little bit from where I am with this. I could have talked about the 19th century, but I thought it would be a chance to bring you up to 2022. Thank you very much.
Merci, thank you, Paul. Donc là, on...
Now we have 10 or 15 minutes to ask Paul questions. The idea here was to really make that link. So from to talk about Freemasonry and slavery without focusing on the slave trade in particular. Of course, in the United States, the situation is completely different. We have a population, a black population that was very much a part of the nation building process, and so the emergence of that black masonry in the person of Prince Hall and his role in the American Masonic landscape. So if there are any questions, comments, I see Fernando asked for the mic, so thank you very much. Eric?
Vibrant and enlightening presentation. I have a statistical question. When we look into the data of Freemasonry in the United States, you see a decline. Is there a difference between the decline of the recognized organizations and an increase in the bogus organizations?
Well, you have to understand that in the United States, a great many things were started. Huge hospitals, orphanages, homes for elderly people. And this was on such an enormous scale that it shaped the whole course of Masonry in America. Today, there are very large retirement colonies now where Masons build homes, things like that. And it shapes the ritual, it shapes the push for orders and things like that. And then again, it is fair, I think, to say that although we have many research lodges and libraries and things, they're incidental to these other things. So when you're looking, like your question suggests, into motivations and ritual and everything else, behind it is money. If I don't have a couple 100,000 members in Illinois, I can't keep my old folks' home and my hospital and things like that going. So when you want to go all the way in one day and make 32-degree Masons starting with Edward Apprentice, well, 700 dues-paying members, And then there is an American psyche. I mean, Americans are not the same as Belgians or French, and you may have noticed that. Now you're happy with 40 or 50,000 in the Grand Orient, but American Grand Master, he can't keep things going with that. He's got all these enormous temples and things, and now it's not working because young people have other things to do. So they don't want to come out on Wednesday night and be bored to death. So, this has become let's grow old together in Masonry. The number of young people joining gets less, and I certainly can't blame them. Now, that isn't true of every lodge. My lodge, very big lodge, has $20, $30 million in endowment, so the meals are very good. You get a free parking ticket. You want to park your car free? Fine. We do spectacular things. For example, we always use 12 ruffians. We would never have 3 ruffians. What's wrong with you people? There are got to be 12 of them. Of course, you need a big room for that. If you put 12 ruffians in here, you'd have a problem. We have the grapes. We have the grapes from when we met in the Grape Tavern in the 1730s. And we carry the grapes around the room every time we do anything. And, you know, we put on a good show. Now, I'm not here to say it's good or bad or you should wear a red fez or all of this. But when you create a huge structure, it dictates what you do. And am I supposed to say to a Grand Master, close the hospital, close the orphanage, because you don't have enough members? No. If he wants to come and go all the way in one day, fine.
Thank you, Paul.
Est-ce qu'il y a une autre question pour Paul? Oui.
Thank you, Paul, for a very enlightening presentation. I wonder whether what you're saying actually reflects a wider methodological problem in our study of Freemasonry, in that it's not just Prince Hall Freemasonry, but there's any number of other orders, and that we have a problem if we tie ourselves into the institutional structure of Freemasonry in our historical studies. So is there a wider methodological problem there? And I suppose the other question would then be, where do you draw the line in defining Freemasonry? A good example is there's an order, a prohibitionist teetotal order called the Good Templars, which began as a Templars outfit, but was not recognized by Grand Lodges and by Templars organizations, and sort of ceased to be considered as Freemasonry. But it was Freemasonry. So again, it's that wider methodological issue.
Well, I wish you had been at the Supreme Council yesterday, because we talked about this. I tried in my opening remarks today to address the need to not just talk about what people were doing in Fiji in 1830. I'm sure, I actually have been to the temple in Fiji. Later on, they burned it down, so I'm glad I went to it. But I, like you, have an interest in the history of it. But as I alluded this morning, I'd like the conferences to take a more general approach to some of these things, such as women. You'll notice that a great many women have been invited this time. And we have a great many papers on women. I hope you agree with that. I hope you think that that's something we need to do. And we can you and I can talk about what you've raised later at length.
Thank you. Thank you. On peut prendre encore une question, parce qu'il faut...
We have time for one last question. We will stop at 12:30, but we have ample time for one last question for Paul. Otherwise, if you're content with all of this and you received enough information, and I should hope so, we will stop here and wrap it up. And thank you again for coming to these presentations. It's quite interactive. We have many interesting discussions, and thank you for the 3 contributors, 3 panelists, and also myself. It will be published in the Chronicles of Historic Masonic History. The communications, the presentations will be published in a special edition of the Chronicles. And maybe we will translate them into English. And thank you to the interpreters and to the technician who is in charge of recording all of it, and to all the people who contributed to making this a reality. Thank you again.